All right, welcome everyone to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. My name is Brett, and we are here today with Juensung Kim, who is one of John's longtime students and now colleague, and had a really fascinating Voices with Vervaeke recently, and has agreed to come on and talk to us about it. Thanks for being here, Juensung.
So it's Junsung.
Oh,
My
Jinsung.
parents had fun with the transliteration system when I was born.
Uh, Thank you, Jinsung. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Uh,
No
so,
problem.
so again, like as John had said in the Voices with Vervaeke, we've heard your name a lot in association with his research. But other than the Voices with Vervaeke, people may not know you as much. So maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, your journey to get here, how you hooked up with John, and what you're doing now.
Uh, oh God, you know what? Let's abuse a fun old storytelling device and start right in the middle with how the heck I met John. Um, yeah, geez, that was almost 10 years ago now. So I guess, long story short, I kind of grew up with my family had kind of two other families that we were pretty close to. So me and their kids all grew up pretty close, the three of us. And one summer, one of them got a job as a camp counselor, and one of them got, I think she went on exchange to France. So to save me sitting on my thumb all summer, and also because I was just incredibly fed up with the public school system, my parents decided, hey, you know what? There's this private school program that offers history courses through the ROM. Um, that sounds like fun. You can stay in a hostel for a summer and just experience living on your own, which is a terrible idea because I've basically lived on my own ever since. Um, but anyway, so first day of that, where we all meet in the foyer, and we're supposed to meet our instructors. And I remember seeing this guy come in with tattoos and piercings and wondering, is he lost? And that's how I met John Vervaeke. He was teaching that history course. So, yeah, that was.
Wait, I don't think I've noticed the piercings. Where are his?
Oh, he's stopped wearing them. He stopped wearing them in the intervening time. But
maybe you could dig up some pictures at some point and send them to us, and I'll be happy to
I mean,
share with the forum.
if you want incriminating pictures, you have to talk to the Cognitive Science and Artificial Intelligence Students Association. Um, he doesn't like this being waved around, but there's a wonderful picture of him from, I want to say, the late '90s hanging on their fridge.
There's a task for us. There's a forum task. We'll track it down.
Please, don't try too hard. You know, I try to leave the Casa kids alone as much as I can. Anyway, so yeah, that's how I met John. Kind of irritated, discontented, possibly too clever for his own good kid around, geez, when was that? 2011, 2012? I can't remember. What is time? Oh yeah, somebody's found a picture of Vervaeke with piercings. I was at that talk, actually, funnily enough.
Oh, great.
That was the fall after I met him. Anyway, so it's funny because up until that point, I was trying to figure out what the heck to do with my life. Part of me wanted to go into possibly law. I had looked into artifact law that seemed like something interesting. I like dead people. I like dead people's stuff. I think dead people have a right to their stuff. Should be no surprise where I ended up. And then, the other half of me actually wanted to go and study prosthetics. I grew up in a household full of assistive devices and physical disabilities of all kinds. So, I like Lego. I like building things. Not great at math, but like the architectural side of engineering, I was pretty good with. So, hey, why not go do that? I didn't feel too strongly about either of them though. And then, towards the end of that course, you know, I should flag I was changing schools in the middle of this, and I was kind of just going through some crap. Anyway, it was kind of the end of class review, and John calls me and says, "Hey, so you've been doing really well, and you've written some interesting stuff, and so don't worry about the academic side of things. I actually just wanted to have a conversation because." Your family got in touch with me back at the beginning of this, and they told me to keep an eye on you because they were a little bit worried that you were going to kind of flame yourself into a hole. And I just want to let you know, I think that would be a waste because I think you could actually make a go of an academic career if you really wanted to try for it. And not to get sappy on people, but I think many of us in this forum have been disaffected kids too smart for their own good at one point in their life, and that was one of the first times that somebody had actually sat me down and had a conversation about, not just how smart I was, but what I could actually do with it. So I decided to go to UofT and give CogSci a try, and kind of the rest is history. Here we are.
I think for a lot of us here, I mean, I came across John's work a lot later in life than you did, but he's had a pretty big effect on all of us, or a lot of us here. That's for sure. So John's talked a lot about this, but for those who aren't familiar, what is cognitive science?
Ask 6 different cognitive scientists, get 12 different answers. So John will explain it as the interdisciplinary study of the mind, kind of with the argument that what you got with cognitive science is you've got kind of a philosophical platform where people can take the best of multiple different disciplines that study the mind and kind of really go into depth. You get the perspectives from neuroscience, the perspectives from computer science, the perspectives from anthropology. I don't think I disagree with that definition as far as what cognitive science is. Everybody's got different visions of it. John will talk about how, there's people who treat cognitive science kind of like the cognitive science is, where they're just like an umbrella head, like the life sciences and things like that, but you don't hear somebody going around calling themselves a life scientist. Then there's the people who treat it like an interfaith dialogue where, people from different camps come together and they'll have a conversation, but it's not terribly productive and everybody goes home and they're still Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or whatever. And then there's kind of the third level where you get the actual genuine syncretists. You get the people who have training in all of the core disciplines. And, the cognitive science program at UofT actually forces you to do that. So I have training in neuroscience. I have training in computer science. For all that those were some of my least favorite courses, but they were fun. So, if you're asking kind of like what's a top tier cognitive scientist, I would say that a top tier cognitive scientist is somebody for whom disciplinary boundaries don't exist.
Yeah, and now you've taken cognitive science in a particular direction, which is the study of spirituality and wisdom and mysticism and meaning and all of that. So tell us about your focus.
Yeah. So if a cognitive scientist is somebody for whom disciplinary boundaries don't exist, I am somebody for whom disciplinary boundaries were at one point a polite suggestion. I occasionally joke at this, and John's joked about this. It's I'm half Korean and half British. For all that I live in Canada, and I grew up with Muslim and Hindu neighbors. Like, I'm bad at being one thing. I am genetically not one thing. I was not raised one thing. I was not trained one thing. I am really, really bad at being one thing. The point where like I can't even get my own spiritual practice right because I spend half the time hanging out with Sufis and the other half hanging out with Unitarians. And then occasionally see Wiccans once a month. Anyway, so what am I doing? It's a good question. So, John's kind of interested in these more wide scale approaches to the meaning crisis. which, you know, I think it's good. Like I'd put him kind of in a similar boat to people like Maslow, who more had kind of a big picture perspective on human nature on their mind when they were doing their work. But, you know, as we'll occasionally say, if John's playing Plato, I'm playing Aristotle. Where, okay, you know, these great high level ideas are fantastic, but how do they actually cash out? You know, I'm kind of in an interesting intermediary phase because I don't agree with a lot of my colleagues in psychology who are, I think, hyper fixated on human despair. But at the same time, you know, it's funny. I'll say that I'm simultaneously more and less optimistic than John is. Where I think John, I think, has like great aspirations for individuals and wants to give individuals tools, but is occasionally fed up with humanity. I, on the other hand, love humanity. I think humans are cute. On the other hand, I find individuals very frustrating. So my particular research is kind of like, okay, so we've spent a whole lot of time looking at how people crawl their way out of despair. That's great. And, you know, that's a motivating factor. But we haven't really looked at the other side of the bell curve very often. Like, you know, there are people who, through a mix of just curiosity, you know, their talents run this particular way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are like, hey, heights of human existence. Okay, I'm going to go climb that mountain. No, I don't have a sad, depressing backstory. I just wanted to do it. You know, some of those people do have sad, depressing backstories, but I guess that's kind of where my research focuses. My focus, broadly construed, is on the study of aspirations, on how, you know, how big do you dream and how do you get there? In particular, with an eye towards self-transcendence, wisdom, things like that. And, you know, it just so happens that most of the people who are trying and most of the tools that you have to try with are found within spiritual, religious, and mystical traditions.
So you study spirituality, but in I guess in a secular sense. So what is spirituality?
Spirituality in a secular sense. Those are two very loaded words that I try to avoid using whenever I can. Mostly just because I think secularity is a bit of a myth. Anyway, what is spirituality? So it's funny. I think I talked about this in the conversation with John, but shortly before that video, I was actually in a roundtable with the Wiccan community that I occasionally spend time with, on the topic of what is magic. And one of the things that came up is that magic is both a feeling and a skill. And I think the same thing applies to spirituality. I think spirituality is simultaneously the felt sense of connection with people, with the world, with the transcendent, with things around you. That deep sense of embeddedness and connectedness and push-pull that you get with the environment. And the body of skills that are required in order to attain that feeling. Because that feeling is trained, that feeling is cultivated. Some people have a natural talent for it. Some people have a natural talent for a whole boatload of things. But, you know, in a lot of us, that needs to be developed.
So now, and you've mentioned magic. Now, first I'd like to ask, how do you spell magic? Do you spell it with a C or is it a CK? And does it make a difference?
I hate the K spelling. I'm biased. I hate the K spelling for the same reason why I don't like letting post-Christians define the word religion. No, you don't get to win. The stage magicians don't get to win. I love stage magic, but they don't have a monopoly on the word. You know, neither does the woo community, right? Like, it's this book written by Abraham Maslow called Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. But it starts with this. It starts with one of the most hilarious rants I think I have ever read. And the rant goes something like, I read in the news the other day that a Christian women's group was protesting taking prayer out of schools because they said it went against spiritual values. Now, my first inclination was to laugh. And then I remembered that no, I too am for spiritual values, and my work goes a lot of the way to demonstrating their validity. Um, so I'm here to talk about spiritual values because I think that letting these people claim a perfectly cromulent word is just doing a disservice, and I am not going to let he uses the delicious word intellectual primitives win. Maslow was writing in the 60s. You can't say that anymore, nor should you say it. But it was kind of an example of this is somebody who has spent 50 years kind of trying to validate a science of spirituality, and he's not about to let the Christian right go off and do whatever they want with the word. I kind of take a similar stance to magic.
So I used the word secular approach to spirituality and I guess magic before, which you didn't like. I guess what I was trying to get at is I guess you if I understand you correctly, you don't take really let's call it, for want of a better word, a supernatural approach to what is going on there. Is that fair?
That's fair. That's fair. And I mean, John's talked in a couple of videos, the Awakening from the Mean Traces series to a certain extent. Also, I think most recently his conversation with, I can't remember the fellow's name, but when talking about building new religion that is not a religion, things to say about that as well. That the supernatural is a historically conditioned thing. And that's true. Like, my philosophical specialties are they're different than John's, for all that he was a major teacher for me. I'm actually better versed in Chinese philosophy. And the supernatural as a concept does not exist in the Chinese philosophy. The concept of ghosts and spirits and gods and the immaterial exist in Chinese thought, but they're not supernatural. They're part of nature. The idea of something supernatural is kind of grounded in this idea of an interventionist deity that just doesn't exist in a lot of places in the world. So, but that's kind of why I don't like it. That's kind of why I don't like the word secular, just because I think you're playing a game you don't have to play.
So what's a better way, in your opinion, of phrasing this idea of not that you're not, I guess, drawing on concepts like supernatural ghosts and gods and So how would you like to frame it?
So I would consider myself personally a naturalist rather than a secularist, because I take a lot of my cues from Confucian philosophy, where if you can demonstrate that something is part of nature, it is not supernatural. And I was at a conference last year talking to a very well-regarded cognitive scientist and a very well-regarded anthropologist about a good, solid naturalistic theory of how you get ghosts. Which, I think that's kind of one of those things that's classically supernatural, but if you can come up with a naturalistic explanation that matches most experiences of ghosts, you have ghosts.
But would it be different than what the people who believe in the supernatural version of ghosts think, or you just not call it supernatural? Would you describe a ghost as an imprint or a lasting part of a soul that's of a person who's died, or?
I mean, from a certain way of thinking, yes, because, basically the take we had on it is, phantom limb syndrome. That sense that when you cut off somebody's limb, the limb is still there. Well, it turns out that we use the exact same cognitive processing to keep track of our bodies that we do to keep track of other people. And so essentially what a ghost is phantom human syndrome. So, from a certain point of view, yes, they are the lasting imprint of a soul that has died, except it's a lasting imprint on your psyche, not necessarily on physics.
So this brings me to a question I have, and in your Voices with Vervaeke with John, he had asked you at one point 2 questions to sort of respond to the skeptics, scoffing at these type of practices, but also the more theistic people who will say that's sacrilege, that's heresy. And I think you went into detail on the skeptic side, but you didn't get to the other side. What do you say to the people who say that by by bringing the spiritual into the mundane, you lose something of the spiritual. That the spiritual shouldn't be the realm of science. It should be outside of science.
So my response is actually the other way, is to reverse this on them and say, why do we confine spirituality to what happens inside of a church? The Sufis say this, the Buddhists say this, like some elements of Christian mysticism say this, the Confucians say it, like it's in pretty much all of the old texts. You need to there needs to be sacredness in everything you do. If you are if you can have a sacred building, why can't I have sacred science? I do not think, it's, I'll borrow from the Renaissance here for a quick second, but it's kind of like, I do not think using every sense and tool at our disposal to kind of revel in the complexity of the world and of creation does any disservice to whoever made it. And I stay kind of agnostic about that. It's, no, I'm not trying to make spirituality mundane. I'm trying to make science spiritual.
So I had a friend who was a Wiccan who's also in cognitive science student, undergrad, mm-hmm. but who also at least expresses belief that they're communicating with the gods or they're drawing on the gods. Do you think that do you think I could get the same kind of spiritual effect with the more secular analysis of what is going on, or sorry, I don't know, mundane, I don't know the best way to frame it, but with the more down to earth approach to it, maybe scientifically deconstructed approach to what's going on in those Wiccan ceremonies? Like, do I lose something by not believing that I'm actually communicating with the god?
I mean, I can only speak personally here, but I don't. So, one of the most powerfully moving experiences that I've had is, there's a mosque that I go to every once in a while just because I like the imam, I like the community. I also like the way that Muslims pray. And because the imam is a dervish, is a Sufi, my internal reworking of exactly what the prayers mean such that it fits to my way of looking at things is kosher. Anyway, so I'd been there for a few months, and he said, hey, the local the Rifai Sufi community is they're holding a ceremony to honor Rumi. It's funny. The anniversary of the death of a Sufi saint is called a wedding anniversary. I can't remember the Persian for it, but basically the idea is they are finally being reunited with what they love most. So this is kind of their take on it. Anyway, so I go along, and it's funny because I occasionally feel like I get split in half a lot, where there's my scientific inclinations and then there's my spiritual inclinations. And, sometimes they work together really well. Sometimes they're in conflict and I have to play with that for a while. But this was one of those experiences where like both of them decided to shake hands and go all in on something, because that was a very powerful experience. It's funny because like I could actually feel like the scientific gears turning in my head saying like, this is one of the most brilliantly designed psychotechnologies I've ever seen. They've brought this in and they've brought this in, and there's this piece of engineering, and to make up for the fact that they can't use psychotropic drugs, they've got in this sort of ecstatic dance, and okay, this is all coming together. This is brilliant. And also the spiritual side of me was very happy because it was a very powerful connecting experience. So, from my personal, where I kind of sit in the world, no, I've kind of just found that bringing together the scientific and the spiritual side of things makes both run better. But I'll admit that, I can't tell people what to believe, right? And this is why I think John is ultimately more optimistic with regards to individuals, because, I love humanity. Humanity is capable of a great many things, but I don't think I'm ever going to discover something that works for everybody.
Right.
Nobody ever has.
I'll ask one more question before we get to some questions from our members. So I asked you about spirituality and magic in the sort of more down to earth sense, but what does transcendent mean in that more down to earth sense? I mean, sense as well. People think of transcendence as reaching up to the heavens and so on. But how do you view transcendence? What does that mean to you?
This is one of the funny things about these conversations is that, like, it's to kind of sidetrack for a second. So I've done historical fencing for a number of years. And I remember when I got to the point that I could read the manual without having somebody needing to explain it to me, because I had done all of the motions in the book. So it's like, oh, yes, this makes sense, and this makes sense, and this makes sense. And then to my surprise, I went and read other manuscripts that I'd never seen before, and I could read those too. Because I had kind of that procedural, participatory ability to enact what I was looking at. So it's kind of like, it's one of those things that's like, this is a very similar thing. It's very hard to explain this concept to somebody who's never felt the sense. But any of you all played Mario?
Yeah, absolutely.
I view a very immersive video game as a transcendence simulator, where you don't just like, especially like if you played Mario Kart or something, where you actually like feel the pressure on your body from something that does not exist. It's funny. I remember watching my parents play Mario Kart, and they're leaning all over the place because that's how they do things. So, I think a really good video game is a transcendence simulator. But essentially, imagine that feeling of immersion into a world where you feel everything vividly. But that's just everywhere. Where, there's things in video games that I think people even subliminally kind of forget, right? Like, when the part of the immersion in a video game is immersion in the story. There's immersion in a plot, right? So you have a sense of purpose in video games that you don't necessarily have in ordinary life, which is part of the feeling of transcendence. I think that's why a lot of people get addicted to video games, because, hey, look, I have purpose in this artificially constructed world that I don't have everywhere else. I'll admit I love video games, but, that's kind of why I use them as a metaphor. Yeah, so I think that sense of full deep dive immersion, and like, I think if anybody's played Undertale I think does a really good job of it, because it's one of the few video games in which choices have consequences. Like, sure, you can go around on a murderous rampage, but like, you don't get to delete your file and start over again. The game that you downloaded remembers that you went on a murderous rampage, to an almost spooky degree. So, that creates a certain sense of immersion, a certain felt sense of consequences for how you deal with the game world, how you interact with NPCs, things like that. So, I think that kind of streamlines the experience, but just kind of imagine feeling that level of everybody. And like, imagine having enough sense of the plot. You're like, okay, I know that if I make this option now, it's going to make this NPC hate me down the line, and that's going to close these options and things like that. Like, we can do that in a video game, but we seem to have a very difficult time doing it in real life. Anyway, that's kind of my weird take on transcendence as applied through a metaphor of video games.
Excellent. Mark, you have a question.
Yeah, so I heard you talk about aspiration, and I heard John talk about that a lot too. And that seems to be, magic, right, to fix a bunch of things in John's world. And I'm always like skeptical when he does that. To be fair, he doesn't do it very often. But aspiration is one of the areas where I just bristle, because I'm like, what do you mean by aspiration? And how do you think you can sort of engender that that aspiration? And you study aspiration, so I thought that was interesting. And then before you answer that, though, I did want to mention something. So when you were talking about participation to Brett, you were mentioning about participate, and then like that kind of fixes the problem around spirituality. And it occurred to me that belief is not required to participate in something, but belief is required in the participation, or maybe the participation can engender the belief. And then that seems to be wrapped up in this idea of aspiration from what I'm hearing from you. But since you're here and I can hear it from you, I'd like to hear more about aspiration and how you think that gets created or encouraged or whatever, and especially outside, because you mentioned this explicitly, outside of getting out of despair. So I'm not in despair, I need an aspiration. If you could expand on that, it's obviously you can riff on it as much as you need to. Thanks.
Sure. So no, I think you've hit the nail on the head where participation in spirituality and that engendering belief and aspiration are all wrapped up in each other. So I'm going to start in a weird place, but so my kid's sister just started undergrad, and for whatever heaven-forsaken reason, her prof assigned them an essay on Pascal's wager. Except here's the problem: nobody understands Pascal's wager. Because Pascal's wager is exactly a wager about participation engendering belief. It is not a wager about belief. Nowhere does he say, try believing in God. No, he says, try acting as though you believe. And, if you think about that, that's like, okay, so I'm going to not be a Christian, but I'm going to follow the 10 Commandments and things like that. And also there's a historical element of Christian witness has really been lost, like this idea that for a very long time, Christian witness was their best recruiting tool. It's this philosophical idea that living as a Christian should make you a better, happier person. And that sense of witness that, I can witness and testify that this has made me a better, happier person. Insert something about Republican evangelicals here. Anyway. But I think it's a similar thing with aspiration, right? So my doctoral thesis is actually on the question of where do aspirations come from? Because you're right, we have no bloody clue. And yeah, it's like John uses it as a bit of a hand wave sometimes, but this is kind of my role in this whole thing. Is like, okay, let's patch the hand wave. Where do aspirations come from? A lot of them do come from running away from something. That's one form of it, right? But that also comes with a fairly strong survivorship metaphor, which is not quite what I'm looking for. It's I study microdosing psychedelics with friends of mine as well. I'm not personally interested in psychedelics, but I'm interested in them kind of from more of an academic standpoint of, okay, this is interesting. These are... people don't necessarily want to commit to the whole go live in a monastery type thing, but they're obviously looking to do something. And you see two narratives. You see the narrative of, oh God, I never want to go back in that depressed hole ever again. And the narrative of, I see that sunny light on the hill up ahead of me and I want to go there. Where that comes from, honestly, I'm still trying to figure that one out. Near as I can tell, funnily enough, it comes from participating, right? It comes from being around people. It comes from being in a community. It comes from awe, from admiration, from I want to be this guy. It's if you look at the historical record of Buddha, right? Buddha got most of his following because he seemed to have figured something out. Sure, people came to him for healing and for advice and essentially for free therapy, but an equal number of his followers came because clearly he had life figured out and they wanted to do whatever he was doing. So I think that's where good aspirations come from. I think kind of the more positive narrative form of aspiration comes from having a goal, having somebody that you admire. Just the very human feeling of I want to be that guy when I grow up. And then you grow up and you meet your heroes and things like that. It's funny. My family was having a conversation about hero worship at one point, and I was just noting that I don't really understand it. And then they were like, "Well, what about Vervaeke?" And I just started laughing. I adore John, but like our relationship, I think, is kind of the epitome of there's no such thing as a hero to the guy who does your laundry. Does that help explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I think. Yeah. So what I heard in there, and feel free to correct me if my thinking is wrong, which it often is. Um, what I heard in there was, there's something about mimicry, right? About emulation, however you want to frame that, right? Which we know about psychologically, we'll say. Um, and there's something about survivalship bias that the survivorship is not clear, right? It's kind of like,
Right.
ooh, steer clear of that one. That looks like a big dragon of the apocalypse right there. And then there's something about running away from versus running towards. And
Yes.
and there's differences. So well, I shouldn't say that. There's potential for differences in all of those, right? Where it could be that running away has some different effect as running towards, right? And then that emulation has yet another different effect. And obviously, you sort of pointed to it, right? Like if you're emulating somebody and then you find out they're not what you thought or what you saw initially, right? You could get sort of shattered. And then you sort of touched on with your story about the Buddha, right? A lot of people just
Yeah.
see Buddha goes and meditates under the tree or something, and everyone's like, that guy's got it going on. That then we're firmly in the realm of magic in my mind, right? Like I don't know what that is. That is a thing. I know that is a thing. I've seen that thing, so I
Yep.
know experientially that is a thing, right? But I
mean,
had nothing.
it's funny because we're doing this. We're finally ready to launch because like this semester's just been an absolute pain to get anything organized. But anyway, we're doing this study that we got funding for to study the relationship between awe, self-transcendence, overcoming self-deception, things like that. Where basically it's just like, okay, awe is supposed to be one of those things that helps you cultivate wisdom. How exactly does it do that? Here's kind of 3 studies that we've got planned. So we're hopefully going to do that soon. We have the money for it. We just kind of need to all get our shit together. Anyway, where was I going with that? Self-transcendent, the ability, mimicry. Sorry, back me up a second because I got lost in bureaucracy.
Great game. Yeah, I was on to this idea of different types of aspiration, right? And then
Yeah.
having different potential side effects like emulation, getting crushed by.
Sorry, yes, sorry. I just got it because you then were like magic and what attracts people to Buddha and things like that.
Yes.
Sorry, that's why I got under this. Because during one of the planning meetings for that study, we were having a conversation about what exactly is going on in awe. And one of the things that's clearly not going on in awe is resolution, right? You don't get any resolution out of awe-inspiring feelings. They do not in and of themselves patch your worldview. They represent an opportunity for your worldview to expand, to crack, to kind of split open, to grow. But they do not they present a problem, but they do not tell you how to resolve the problem. And kind of the extent to which you have an internal toolbox to solve the problem is the extent to which you'll experience either awe or horror, more or less. Some people are horrified when you show them the void. Others have questions. But during that, we kind of got into this. Okay, so what are things that kind of cause a problem and cause a resolution at exactly the same time? And one of our collaborators was talking about like, oh, I think cults do that. And then John just starts laughing. It's like, I think you've accidentally just created a theory of charisma. Like very charismatic individuals are kind of people who are like, I didn't know this was missing from my life, but this person can give it to me. Which, yes, is how you get cults. Funnily enough, I think it's also why magic is a very scary thing, because magic doesn't need a person to be charismatic. Magic and esotericism, by their very existence, represent a problematization of a worldview and a potential solution. And I think this is why so many people get wrapped up in magic, mysticism, and esotericism and, accidentally have stuff happen to them. Because there's kind of a fatal attraction going on there. Anyway, yeah, I do think you are squarely within the realm of magic right there. You're at the very least, you're squarely within the realm of charisma. And one of the first things that any mystic or magician starts developing is a form of personal magnetism. And it's actually funny because a lot of the Buddhist code is around how to limit that personal magnetism. For example, Buddhist monks are not allowed to teach unless asked. It's to stop them from proselytizing and stop them from forming personal cults. Is it always successful? Not really, but, you know, when was the last time you saw somebody on a street corner hanging out Buddhist leaflets? Anyway, does that help?
That helps a lot, actually, right? So, I mean, I think we've identified sort of two immediate types of aspiration and two potential positives and negatives to how they work, right? So there's this idea of either running away or running towards, right? That's one type. It's the negative and positive of one type. And then the other type is awe versus horror, right?
Yeah.
And then we've sort of locus around a third thing that you've labeled magic. And I love this definition. This is just a gorgeous, sexy definition. You know, that magic is sort of something that doesn't need a person to be charismatic. I think that's a really remarkable statement, and
No, I think
deeply correct.
I think there's more than that to magic, right? Like, I think
sure,
one of the qualities of magic, but I think that's kind of one of the. There needs to be kind of there needs to be a more neutral word that's related to. Oh, sorry, 1 second. I'm just gonna mute myself because some alarm is going off.
So.
Oh, how annoying!
And thank you everyone for being here. And remember, if you have a question, you could queue it up in event text. And I'm glad you're all here. If you haven't listened to the Voices with Vervaeke episode, you definitely need to. It's just fascinating talk.
Okay, I think I'm back. There might be like quiet chirping, but like I'd say once every other month somebody in this building. I live in a fairly student-populated building, so some people haven't learned not to smoke indoors.
Yeah, so you did kind of. I think we kind of put that to bed, at least from my perspective. I've got a map there, and then it leads right. There's still that question, that dragon of the apocalypse, at least from my perspective of charisma and what what someone like John say engenders. You know, one of the interesting things that happens here is that people come onto this particular Discord server and they behave better, right? And I don't know what that is, right?
Yeah,
so
I mean, it's community pressure, social pressure is a thing, right? Like, we are collaborative creatures. I don't know. I mean, like, it's funny because, like, John is a highly charismatic individual, at least when he's on stage. He's an awkward mess in person, which is kind of hilarious. But again, I will preface, I adore John, but we have a very different working relationship. So, yeah, it's because, every time here's something that problematizes your worldview, and here's a possible solution to it wrapped up in one package.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. So we're back to charisma. So someday I'll find somebody who can explain charisma, but maybe no one can forever. So
well, I mean, awesome. I think charisma, at its base level is kind of this, like, somebody simultaneously presents a problem and a solution. It's just, I think a lot of that plays on. I think a lot of it plays as much on eros as anything else, right? Like, because people are like, oh, this very pretty person. I didn't realize there was a person this pretty, but I could possess this thing. And, it's insert Plato grumbling here.
Eric, you have a question.
Yeah. Hi, Juensung. Thanks for coming. Hey. We touched on this a bit already, but I'd like to hear you talk more directly about the relationship between magic and spirituality, and the similarities and differences.
I mean, I personally don't see a difference. I think from a certain point of view, every spirituality is magic. The reason why we have different words for it is because, it's part of it is historical, right? Like, the word magic derives from magi, like the word in Magoi, in Greek for Zoroastrian priests. Right. So from its very beginning, magic has always had this connotations of the spirituality of the other, of the outsider, of the not us. One of the reasons why I choose to use the word magic instead of spirituality is it's largely rhetorical. I don't like this whole like, oh yes, our like our jhanas and yogas and things like that are just wonderful spirituality, but that stuff, that's magic. No, all of it's magic. And the sooner we kind of get used to that idea, the sooner we can move on. Because I don't know, it's a lot of what I do is just playing language games with people's comfort zones, which I admit is maybe not always something I should be doing. But kind of my take on it is, I'm young. I don't have John's responsibilities. I can afford it at the moment. Anyway, so that's my take on the relationship between magic and spirituality. As far as I'm concerned, is that there's really not a difference aside from what you're comfortable with. Some people will say that they divide along lines of like speak and listen, right? Where spirituality is trying to conform yourself to the world, whereas magic is trying to make the world conform to you. Except the Wiccans don't use magic that way, so that comes up with all sorts of problematic stuff. It's if you open any book of magic, basically the first thing that it tells you is you cannot make nature do anything it wasn't going to do anyway. Which I think is also, further complications for supernaturalism, right? Because like everybody's like, oh man, they're going to like make the clouds rain frogs. It's like, one of the first things that any book of magic, especially in the modern era, tells you is no, magic does not do that. And even if you look at books of like Renaissance magic, a lot of the practices are imaginal. There's very few, here's how you warp nature. To the extent that they are, here's how you warp nature. It's like, here's how to increase the probability of rain, which can be as much a perceptual thing as anything else. You might say that like magic has kind of more applied effects. Spirituality can also have applied effects. Like really, if you're like into any Buddhist esotericism, where's my copy of that book? Here it is. So I don't know if any of you have heard of the Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification. It's a 5th century Theravadan Buddhist meditation manual, and it spends a decent chunk of the book right in the middle enumerating various supernormal powers and how to get them. It's like, no, this is by any reasonable definition magic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. I think the speaking versus listening distinction is kind of what I've been using so far, but it's interesting to hear you talk about how these traditions that I'm not familiar with and how they do kind of emphasize more of the listening aspect already. So thanks.
Yeah. I learned Tai Chi from John, but I'd also been practicing martial arts of one sort or another for a long time before I met him. But one of the reasons why I think, it's easy to confuse magic as being speak versus spirituality as listen is because, much like in principles of Tai Chi and principles of Aikido, you're supposed to blend with opposing forces in order to move them. And I think if you pick up a book on spirituality, it will emphasize the blending. If you pick up a book on magic, it will emphasize the moving. But they're two halves of a coin. You need to blend in order to move, and if you only blend and don't move, you just lose yourself in the noise.
Yeah, interesting. I like that. Do you think maybe there's a difference in intention there, or am I just reading too much into that?
Yes and no, right? I mean, like, the category of black magic exists for a reason, which is actually one of the reasons I prefer the term magic over the term spirituality, because I think there's such a thing as black spirituality. And like, no, you know what? I'm going to rephrase that. There's such a thing as negative spirituality. There's also such a thing as black spirituality, and like, black and African diaspora spiritual traditions are wonderful, glorious things. But let's stop using the word black magic. Black magic is a thing. It's wonderful, but it's not negative magic. Because it's funny, like both of those actually seem to, from what I can tell, positive magic and negative magic seem to operate on a boundary of consent, with nature being something that also has to give consent. You know, any forms of negative magic are ways to essentially violate somebody's bounds of privacy through non-consensual means, or violate nature's law through non-consensual means. Most books on magic are also pretty clear on the fact that negative magic doesn't actually work. Nature won't do anything except what nature already wanted to do. Yeah, I mean, maybe there's differences in intent, but like, you know, John's talked about spiritual bypassing in some of his videos, right? Like, some people get into spirituality because they want to manipulate the world around them and don't want to deal with any of their problems. I don't see a difference between that and necromancy. Some cases, necromancy is safer.
Hey.
Fair enough. Thanks. Yeah, I like the positive versus negative instead of the, I guess, foreign versus comfort zone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Rob, you have a question.
Yeah, although now I've got like 3 more, but like, but so, okay, so I was going to ask something about the aspiration thing, but then we started going into magic, which is a field that I study and practice as well. And in Hermetic magic, it's interesting because the conception is that you're co-creating with the arena during Hermetic ritual. Yeah, so it's not speaking or listening, but doing both at the same time in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I came to magic after a martial arts background, right? So for me, speak and listen are not different things.
Okay.
A really good debate should be the same thing as well, right? You know, John likes talking about dialectic a lot.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
It's not speak and then, it's not listen and then speak, or speak and then listen. It's speak and listen, speak and listen.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's almost that goes back to Taoism in that way, where they're not separable. You have to conceptualize the whole and the two simultaneously, I think. But anyway, so aspiration. Well, okay, so magic is you can't get magic without aspiration. Is that about right?
So.
Okay, that's what I think. Okay, and so is aspiration?
Sorry, let me flag that. You can, but you should be in therapy instead.
Okay.
It's like, you know,
Right.
Sure, you can get magic by running away from something. You shouldn't.
Okay, fair enough. Doing it positively, I would say, would probably entail an aspiration of some kind.
Yeah, I'd say.
Okay. Is then aspiration part of our noticing that certain patterns within our pattern sorting database are preferable to other patterns? Because it seems like we're doing this thing where it's a pattern recognition thing, right? Where we're recognizing our own pattern, comparing it to an alternate pattern, and making a judgment call. I still don't know where you get the judgment call, except for like, that works better. What's our definition of works, right? Flourish. Mm-hmm. But is the aspiration necessarily something where it's comparative? It has to be. But is it part of that, like an evolutionary algorithm that sorts functionality into categories of tiers and says like, okay, that one is better, let's move towards that, or that one's worse, let's move away from that? So would aspiration be like the optimizing of that process?
I think to an extent, you know, it's there's a bunch of people in lifespan development who essentially study goal pursuit with stuff like, you know, selection optimization and is it cancellation? Basically, it's like, it's how you pick your goals, how you optimize your goals, and how you get rid of your goals.
Okay.
SOC, that's like one method of studying that. I think Alexandra Freund is the one who has the the most information on that. I don't think it's just like a matter of personal preference, right? Like chocolate ice cream is a matter of personal preference. So I do think that there's something deeper driving it. John, is this paper's kind of bottlenecked just because COVID got everybody really busy and scrambling, but we're working on a paper on trying to figure out, like, essentially the evolutionary motivators for the pursuit of meaning in life. Like, what is meaning on an evolutionary level? And, I think meaning is a thing on an evolutionary level. Like, I talk to my students about this occasionally, where the evolution, like one of the best evolutionary adaptations of humans is that we can evolve within a single generation. Philosophers of science will talk about the distinction between phylogeny and ontogeny, right? For example, bacteria have phylogeny on lock, right? Like, they will adapt to whatever environment they find themselves in. Sure, it will take them 20 generations, but they'll do it, right? Because they live and die and reproduce so darn quickly. Humans, on the other hand, we've got pretty long lifespans for creatures on Earth, right? We're also infants for a large chunk of them. So one of the things that a human can pull off is a human can pull off ontogeny. A human can pull off single generation evolution. It'll be dirty, it'll be messy. Half of us will die, yes, but gosh darn it, we will manage to live above the Arctic Circle somehow. And I think aspiration, well, it's, if I was to put two sides of a coin up, aspiration and desperation are the things that are driving that. There's desperation is I want to survive, and aspiration is I want to do it well.
Thrive, right? As opposed to just surviving, right? Flourishing, yeah.
Yeah, because it's not enough for us to just survive. We have to thrive, right? Like, this is a thing that humans do. Granted, we can get used to anything, but, it's like we don't like those states given other options.
Do you consider the neurological changes going on in our brains a kind of evolution?
I mean, I consider them a kind of ontogeny, which is like, I'll call it evolution for the sake of more of a rhetorical point. Like, from a purely technical sense, evolution only happens at a phylogenetic level.
Yeah.
But in a more rhetorical sense, especially when I'm talking to undergraduate students, one of the things that makes humans special is that we are capable of pulling off ontogeny. We are capable of adapting and enacting, essentially enacting natural selection on a behavioral level within a single generation.
Right.
We can't spontaneously grow new we can't spontaneously grow new limbs, but gosh darn it, we can build an exoskeleton or bows or arrows or spears or, it's like, these are great little things because we can plug literally any other organ we need into them.
Right. Yeah.
We don't have claws, but I can get a sword real darn fast.
Yeah, it's okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure.
Just to reiterate. Sorry. Just to reiterate.
Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, what goes on in the brain is not evolution at a phylogenetic level, because basically it's like the stuff that goes on there isn't heritable. It's behaviorally heritable, and there's something called the it's the Baldwin effect, where eventually things that are behaviorally advantageous get selected for genetically. For example, hypnotizability in humans. Hypnotizability was evolutionarily advantageous, so we started selecting for the ability to be hypnotized. Because let's face it, if your only medicine is hypnotism and 10% of your population is hypnotizable and 5% of the other village's population is hypnotizable, yours is more survivable. So yeah, it's what goes on in the brain is not evolution in a technical sense, but it acts like it within a single generation. I think you only have to look at, like, everybody's seen the memes of, like, behind every underpaid millennial is a boomer who can't open a PDF. You know,
Oh
it's
my
like
God, that's
there's
in my life.
there's rapid adaptation, right?
Mhm.
That didn't happen phylogenetically, but like the idea, it is, I think, incontrovertible that behavioral evolution happened rapidly in the last 50 years.
Mhm. So is aspiration then part of that sorting mechanism that sorts it, because we don't have we can't, because aspirations are potentials, right? We don't rely on the environment for the pressure. In some sense, we rely upon like other ideas for that pressure.
It's,
Does that make sense?
I mean, you know, we have things like the flow state, right? Where that's kind of an intrinsic reward drive that we have. And we think that the sense of meaning is related to that somehow, right? So your average human does kind of come pre-packaged with this idea of, I want to live a flourishing life. You know, it takes a lot of effort to kill that in people. You can kill it, but like we kind of view that with horror for a reason, I think. You know, it's like, sure, you can dehumanize somebody, right? But I think it's kind of, the hint is in the name, right? If you want to kill off that sense of aspiration, you have to dehumanize somebody, which is horrible, right? Like, I think the worst thing that you can do is kill somebody's ability to dream bigger. And not necessarily in like the capitalist sense of, I want a bigger house and like all the horses and bells and whistles and gold-plated toilet seats I can afford, right? But in the sense of, the worst thing that you can do to somebody is kill off their idea that they could possibly live a happier life.
Hope, right? That's you're killing
exactly.
hope. Like,
yeah, it's like, you know, you know, it's like that's one of the worst things you can do to people.
Doesn't it have the opposite effect sometimes, where it drives people to do even better and greater?
Then your hope has not been killed. Somebody has tried, and I think we've all had that one asshole teacher who told us we were never going to amount to anything. And I will fully admit, a lot of what I do today is completely in spite of those people. But it means that they didn't succeed, right?
But if they didn't try, would you be where you are?
See, that's a delicate balance there, right? Because, you know, people like to say it's like, I got here in spite of everybody. Okay, great. But who told you that they were wrong? Or who showed you a world in which it was plausible that they were wrong? Right? Because if everybody around you tells you that you're never going to amount to anything for your entire life, you will never amount to anything, right? Because you have no evidence to the contrary. So, you know, I think, you know, we have a habit of doing this, humans, right? Like, we fixate on the negative. But suffering and the negativity and all that stuff in and of itself is actually kind of meaningless, right? And they've even actually kind of found this, funnily enough, in trauma research. Usually the event itself is not the thing that is predictive of trauma. It is what happens immediately after the event that is predictive of trauma. It is not feeling believed. It is not feeling cared for. It is having nobody there, right? Those are the things that traumatize people. It's not necessarily the bad thing in and of itself.
It's kind of like how you relate to it. I think Kelly McGonigal did some research on this with her research on willpower.
Sorry, that was a little bit garbled. I missed the first half of your sentence.
I was just commenting that I've read some research before that, you know, that aligns with that.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, sorry, it's just because you use the word willpower, and I'm a little bit suspect of that research just because replication crisis. Long story short on that one, science is complicated, math is hard, and sometimes when you go looking for something, you don't find it. So, you know, it's kind of one of those things where, like, yes, willpower is an observable phenomenon. Some people seem to have stronger willpower than others, but we've never been able to figure out why.
Well, this is a question. This leads to a question I had actually, which is so you're studying the ways in which people can change and develop on purpose, as well as aspiration. Now, we can have the aspiration to change. We can know about the psychotechnologies and practices that will help facilitate and cultivate that change, but the doing it not once, not twice, but on a regular basis and over a long period of time to get to the point where you succeed in that second order effective change is another question entirely. How have you looked at that question of what, and it relates to willpower, like how what helps people stick to it, to these practices, which can they take a lot of time. They can, you have to make them a big part of your life, and they're often not easy. So it's a big commitment to do all the stuff that John's been talking about and the stuff we're trying to do on this forum.
Yep. Buddha had a pretty good. Buddha did a pretty good job with this one. You need the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, right? You need the figure to which you are aspiring, right? You need the Buddha. You need a system of psychotechnologies in order to get there. You need the Dharma. And you need the Sangha. You need community. You need other people around you who are doing the same thing, because it is very difficult to aspire in a vacuum. And that seems to be pretty consistent. So one of the things on my docket for probably next semester is there's a model of post-traumatic growth that I find very interesting, because it just starts with event interpreted as bad, and then the trauma has nothing to do with the rest of it. And one of the things that I want to do is say, okay, like they say this themselves, it doesn't need to be a bad thing that targets that spiral, right? Like, this is just a growth spiral. This is just a complexification spiral. You can self-trigger it. But, a lot of the things in it are basically like talking to other people, getting out of your head, learning to expand your cognitive view, reading, writing, like talking to people. Yeah. I think you need other people in order to aspire and transcend, right? Like, it's funny just because, like, God, academics, man. Like, we spent an entire 3 hours last summer getting into an argument as to whether a person could be wise on a desert island, or I guess more specifically, whether eating all of the coconuts on the island in a single afternoon constituted a foolish decision because it only affected you. It's like, our intuition is yes, but why? If wisdom is a socially defined thing, it's just like, I love and hate my colleagues simultaneously. Sorry, just because I see this question from Pedro that I can answer really quickly. Necromancy is divination or finding out information by means of talking to dead people. It was frowned on in most cultures. It's also kind of now been conflated with summoning zombies. But, it's usually, necromancy is kind of paradigmatic bad magic. That was just okay. We can move on now.
And Pedro had another question as well. Go ahead, Pedro.
Yes, well, you talked about hypnotizability as being advantageous in evolution, and I'm quite curious about it. Like, how do you think it relates to spirituality, and on a more practical level, if it makes sense to ask that here in this context, how is it induced, or how do we make it basically?
I mean, to kind of shorthand a very, very long conversation, you actually need to be hypnotizable in order to get anything out of spirituality. Because so Tanya Lerman's done a lot of this work, and if you're not familiar with her research, go read it, because it's.
Could you please repeat the name?
Tanya Lerman. Here, I can put the name in chat if you like.
Thank you.
Oops, sorry. There you go. I've been trying to get John to read her work for a while. Anyway, so she's an interesting person because she's a psychological anthropologist, and her kind of subspecialty is normal people who hear voices. She's worked with ceremonial magicians in England. She's worked with evangelical Christians in the United States. And kind of just looking at, okay, people claim to talk to God and spirits. How? And it's interesting because what she's found is that, so there's this call it a personality characteristic. It's not really a personality characteristic. I don't know how to call it. Anyway, it's a quality called absorption. And the absorption scale started life as a hypnotizability measure, but more or less what it is a measure of the vividness of your imagination. And I don't mean kind of like in a like child, like, oh, I have an imaginary friend sense. I mean, to what extent can you make unreality real? So, you know, it's, I have a nice version of this exercise and I have a somewhat mean version of this exercise, but let's go with the nice version of this exercise for now. Because there's an actual scale to measure this, but, you know, it's, I want you to imagine you're in a bakery. Just like close your eyes, imagine you're in a bakery. Okay. Some of you will get the visual imagery of being in a bakery. Some of you will get the visual and especially, I can't remember, olfactory vision of being in a bakery. You'll start smelling baking bread. But some of you will start feeling the warmth of ovens and the differential heat of like the bakery on your front versus the cold of the door on the back. Some of you will start feeling people around you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are levels of detail and layers of complexity that get added on to the imagining that you are in a bakery, depending on the strength of your imagination. And that ability to make what is unreal feel real to you underlies both a lot of spirituality, especially a lot of more advanced practices, and the ability to be hypnotized. Because essentially what, you know, if I dip my toes back into Cogsci, what I suspect is going on there is basically how much of your nervous system is accessible to your voluntary control, which is basically say like how many of your senses can you run on purpose at once. And then hypnotism is essentially psychic surgery, right? Like it's basically like, ooh, here's somebody's sensory system. How can I play around with this, right? So, you know, it's being high in absorption means that your system is more accessible to you. It also means that your system is more accessible to other people just because kind of, you know, the gears are well greased, as it were. So maybe that might be a little bit complicated, but that's kind of my overview of the relationship between spirituality and hypnotism. They are both kind of sat in this root category of you need a pretty strong imagination in order to do anything with it. New aspiration, stronger imagination. That's a good aspiration for everybody. And funnily enough, it's a trainable skill. It takes work, but you can do it. If you don't want to go through, you know, if you don't want to go through like some very classical spiritual training, I recommend taking art classes. Similar skill set. It'll do in a pinch.
Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome. It's a good question.
Mark, you had another question.
I did. So you mentioned the religion that is not a religion earlier, I think, at least quickly. Yeah. And I wanted to tie that back because inspiration or something, right? So one of the things that sort of popped into my head is, you know, you put together this beautiful formula about the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And for some reason, hearing it this time, and you know, I'll just invoke magic. I don't know why this time and not other times. It just popped out. In the context of everything else you've been talking about as a formula for creating a religion. Right. So you add charisma, those three components, bang, you have potentially a cult. And then we have a member on here, Nick, who was talking about cults. And his theory is something like there's positive and negative cults, but religions are cults are cults. Like everything's a cult because cult is part of culture. Right. And I kind of agree with that, right? So what do you think in terms of, you know, magic formula for religion? Like those are the ingredients, the four ingredients, or maybe there's a couple more.
Those are the formula. So that is the formula for an aspirational system. Religions are inherently aspirational systems, but they're not the only ones, right? Like if you want to get anywhere in sports, for instance, you need to have the exact same formula. You know, it's kind of like getting good at a sport is also an aspirational thing, but like doesn't really have anything to do with religion, which is kind of why I like limit my scope. Is I'm interested in aspiration as it applies to self-transcendence. Because sure, I could go off and study sports-based aspirations, but I hate sports. So why? It's okay, that's not fair. I don't hate all sports. I love watching fencing, boxing, and things like that, but I don't like team spectator sports. Just don't see the point. More power to you if you do, though.
They
Anyway.
look a lot like a religion to me. So I moved down south, and college football is indistinguishable from a church. It's really, I mean, they dress up, they go on a pilgrimage, right, to go to the games.
Because it makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than you are, right? And I'm not going to knock that. It's my colleagues have occasionally joked of like, oh, here's Juensung staring down his long spiritual nose at the unwashed masses and their football and stuff like that. Like, yeah, I'll cop to that sometimes. Like, I'm not perfect. I have opinions. Anyway, sorry, you were talking about cults and culture and yeah.
So you're saying that there's another formula. So if we say that that's a formula, there's an aspirational formula that makes a religion, and then I would just argue that and sports is a religion. Spectator sports at that level is a religion, and that it's sort of like a sub religion, right? Because the people who go to the games down here are not all going to the same church. We'll say, although maybe they're all Christians. I don't know. That would be an interesting thing to find out, but I don't know that we could get a clean enough data set. Are there other formulas then that you're saying, other than say non-aspirational religious formulas that you've recognized or that you noticed? And how does that tie to Ritnar? Because that's one of the things we do here is talk about Ritnar a lot, or at least some of us.
Okay, so I have to be honest. I think Ritnar is an attempt to reinvent Confucianism. And I laugh at John about this periodically because I have been trying to convince him to brush back up on Confucianism for years, and he still has not done it. So if any of you want to annoy him about that, I will thank you for it.
I don't want to annoy him, but I am actually not a fan of our little Ritnar project here for similar sorts of reasons. But I'm supporting them. So I'm always interested to hear what people think about the progress and the process and how they can contribute. And it sounds like if aspiration is one way, if an aspirational system is one type of religious system, and there might be others, then that would be interesting, at least to them. I mean, it's fascinating to me too.
Right. I mean, it's all that's underlying an aspect. Like, okay, so let's separate things out. There is the desire to grow, and there is the desire to belong, right? The reason why I would not class American football, and let's be honest, a lot of forms of American Christianity, as necessarily religions is because they don't, or at least not spiritual, is because they don't have that accompanying need to grow. This is one of the criticisms of organized religion that I do agree with, is I think in some cases people use this as an excuse to stay static. I think Christianity is occasionally guilty of this. Islam's also guilty of this to an extent. Judaism, less so to my experience, but basically it's like...
That's spiritual bypassing then.
Yeah, exactly, because there's basically this and especially because kind of Christianity comes with a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card of like, yes, I believe that Jesus is my savior, therefore I am saved. Meanwhile, it's... the Catholic Church used to kind of have this like, no, you need both faith and works. One in and of themselves is not sufficient. So, I think people have kind of been taking faith and running with it, but have kind of forgotten the works bit. And then some people have taken the works bit and kind of forgotten the faith bit. Like capitalism is a great example of that. Works. Yeah. Yeah, so I think you need to have a desire to grow in order for something to be an aspirational system, right? And you can get that growth from running away from something. You can get that growth towards running towards something, right? Like, the people who like have like an ideal body stuck to their fridge as part of a dieting thing, right? Like, okay, fine, that's one form of an aspiration. Or kids in like college basketball who have a poster of Michael Jordan on their bedroom wall, right? But basically, you need your target value, you need your Buddha, you need your community, and you need your Dharma. You need your how am I going to do this? You know, Tanya Lerman actually, funnily enough, has a similar system where she argues that a lot of what underlies magical practices is a combination of what she calls proclivity. So this is essentially absorption, like you're essentially just raw natural talent. You can compare it to like muscle mass and things like that. You can grow it, obviously, but then there's like the actual practice hours that you sink in. But there's also cultural expectancies that tell you, okay, after, sometimes this happens for people after 3 months of meditation. Sometimes it happens after 6 years, but you will eventually see this bright glowing light. Don't worry, that is perfectly normal. If the light is red, that is not normal. Come go see a teacher. But if it's just like a normal white bright light, yep, everything's normal. Keep going, because they give you a map, right? Don't underestimate the power of a map. But if you're going to tie that back to the religion, yeah, like there are systems of belonging that are not necessarily systems of growth. A good system of growth will come with a system of belonging, but one is not necessarily the other. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, it does. But what I heard in there is that there are two types of aspiration. So aspiration to belong versus aspiration to grow.
So I don't think aspiration to belong is an aspiration.
Okay, fair enough.
Yep, I think it's just like, it's funny. It's like, so there's this thing used in psychology sometimes called the need to belong scale. And then the same authors came out with the single item need to belong scale, because they ran the psychometrics, and it turns out that like one item on the need to belong scale was doing 80% of the psychometric work. Take a wild guess as to what that item was. No. Rate how true of yourself this is on a scale of 1 to 5. I have a strong need to belong.
Okay.
Turns out you could just ask people, and they're a pretty good judge of it.
I'll tell you right away. But you still identified what I would think of as two types of aspiration. And again, we can throw out the word, but you talked about like, oh, if you're in a sport, you want to be like Michael Jordan, right? Versus if you want to grow, and you seem to make a distinction there. And maybe there isn't one, but it's interesting if there is. And do you have any thoughts on that?
I would not make that. I would not make that distinction, because I think like within the realm of like college basketball, be like Michael Jordan and grow as a basketball player are just the same thing, right? Like Michael Jordan is your target value for somebody who has done really well at being a basketball player. I think one of the things with aspiration is, so as of 2018, aspiration is actually a technical term within the philosophical literature where it refers specifically to a desire to transform. Becoming a parent is also an aspiration, right? I guess becoming a parent is kind of a paradigmatic transformation, but like there is, and you also have to make the distinction between wanting to have offspring, right? And wanting to be a parent, wanting to like raise a child to help somebody else grow. It's kind of a similar aspiration to becoming a teacher. There's a difference between you are legally responsible for these 30 kids and you have an actual desire to be the sort of person who can help these people grow.
Yeah. So there, what I think you did there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you categorize two types of aspiration. One as a having mode and one as a being mode, just to use John's terms, because we love to use John's terms.
Sure. I would argue that people with, let's use your terminology. People with a having mode aspiration would call it an aspiration. I would say in a very technical sense, it is not. It looks like an aspiration, it walks like an aspiration, but it does not quack like an aspiration because it doesn't actually cause you to change. The self-transformation literature and philosophy, kind of like Agnes Callard talks about this, Laurie Paul, there's a distinction made in that literature between self-transformation and self-cultivation. So self-transformation involves you gaining new values that you did not previously have. Like, it is a fundamental change in your orientation to the world. Self-cultivation is just getting better at what you already do. Getting rich, for instance, is arguably just a form of self-cultivation. You already value being rich, right? It's a very bad form of self-cultivation. No, here I am looking down my spiritual nose at the unwashed masses again. But it's kind of like, okay, you're rich. We have empirical evidence that, like, past being able to sustain yourself comfortably, money does not make you any happier, and in fact actually just makes you more anxious. So what did this accomplish exactly?
I like that distinction: transformation versus cultivation. I think that's really important.
Yeah, because it's, you can get better at being a bad person.
Yes, you can.
Maybe it's a horrible thing to say, but yeah, no, you can absolutely get better at being a bad person.
Yeah, no, I did that for a while. It was great.
Yeah.
So it's like climbing an adaptive niche instead of crossing a valley to another hill. Right?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. So, hey, welcome, and thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Callie and I listened to your talk with John, and I thought
Oh,
it was fascinating. Well, I've always been fascinated by these things. And I have many of the same questions. And so, there's something about being human which has to do with, so this absorption term, this is really interesting. You are constantly absorbing sense data about the world, like the state of the world, right? You're constantly receiving it as a stream and all these various modes that we call senses. And then we like construct our behaviors in the world based on that constant stream. It's like, it's like little mouths, right? We're consuming bits of the world, and yeah, we're absorbing it into us and transforming it into something like intention and thought and behavior.
Now, I will flag that's not actually where the term absorption ended up coming from. It has to do with being absorbed in the imagery, right? Like, basically.
Sure. Yeah. I didn't mean to imply genesis, but there's some connection there, I think, with the direct experience that we have.
Yeah.
The point that you were making earlier about this capacity to develop the illusory within, right? To appreciate like something that is other than what is currently being received, and like how many senses you can bring into it. This imaginative capacity makes one more likely to be hypnotized. I think. Would you say it also makes one also more capable of hypnotizing? Right?
It helps.
Right.
It helps. I don't necessarily think you need to be high in hypnotizability in order to hypnotize people.
Mm-hmm. How you measure that hypnotizability seems to matter, though, right? Because there are like different methods, let's say, by which one is hypnotized. So this is interesting because I was thinking about charisma in this way, in some sense, that the ability to understand what is the most absorbing by the perspective of that which you are communicating to is the ability to replicate this interior conception and then to drive your behaviors to meet such. Right. And so there's something about recognizing the ability to transpose those elements and then drive your own willpower through that, right? To grant it as much reality as you possibly can to the individual that you're conveying it to.
I will say it doesn't necessarily have to do with hypnotizability, but being high in absorption does make you a better artist. Because it's kind of like, this is a bad example, but like, you can cook without having a sense of taste. That is a thing you can do. You may not be very good at it, but you can do it.
Sure. Well, you can rely upon the responses of others to tell you.
Exactly. So like that, that's one manner of training hypnotists, right? Is like after a certain amount of time, they will be able to figure out how to hypnotize people just by having figured it out through kind of their reflection in other people's faces.
Right.
But being high in absorption does seem or at least like, this is one of those things where like their like talent and proclivity kind of wrap themselves up here. The more naturally gifted you are at something, the more likely you are to do it, and vice versa. So honestly, I kind of just think that like talent is really just enjoying practice. Anyway, like research is that musicians and artists and poets tend to be very high in absorption, right? And that makes sense. It's like your ability to make the unreal real to yourself is going to help you with art, help you with poetry, help you with visualization, help you with music.
Right. Right. So I mean, like this is the self-generating capacity, right? In some sense, the self-driven individuals is auto-hypnotizing their way through life. Right?
That's how you accomplish trance states, right? Like,
yeah. Well, but just maybe that's just maybe there's a component of that overlay which is occurring always in our thought, right? That there is perhaps a spectrum of capacity by which one can alter the potential possible future states that are currently available to you, right? And if this is correlated somehow in my mind with intelligence, right, with the ability to see the total available creative ways in which one can efficiently maximize the future possible states. It's something like that. And it's related
it really depends on how you're assessing intelligence, because one of the problems that
this is using Alex Wisner-Gross's work, essentially, that is defining entropy and intelligence in this way, that it's the capacity to maximize the future available energy or possible states. So
sure, I mean, here's kind of where I would get worried about that. Mm-hmm. So I've met many smart people without a lick of imagination, and I've met many very imaginative people with absolutely no mental discipline. Because it's one of the problems with absorption. It is that it is very, very possible to be high in absorption and do crap all with it, right? Like,
sure. Would you say this is something like fluid and crystallized intelligence, maybe?
Yeah, to an extent. They don't map on, but sure, we can use that metaphor. It's intelligence is basically just your ability to like use information, right?
Yeah.
However, the absorption in your imagination, and especially trained use of the imagination, trained, disciplined use of it, increases the amount of information you have at your disposal. So, basically, if you are a particularly smart person with a particularly vivid and disciplined imagination, you are a very scary person.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, right? But this is also something that has to do with like partitioning inwards, and then this more agglutinative process of adding onto, right? That those are actually, I think, discrete components that can be separated out in the way that we create things, right?
Yeah. You can separate out imagination and intelligence, but it's kind of one of those like, like if you've watched like high level dance, right? You can separate out coordination and strength and rhythm and things like that, right? But a masterful dancer is going to weave all of these individual physical skills into just a like glorious tapestry of performance. And watching somebody who has a very kind of like, to borrow the unfortunate metaphor of the split brain, both halves of their mind, like kind of all of their different mental faculties very strongly disciplined. These people are just a glorious thing to watch. High-level mathematicians tend to do it very well. Although, then again, it's funny because I was talking to a friend of mine who's a math PhD at Stanford, and they're saying, yeah, this is probably why the stereotype of the mad mathematician exists.
Yeah. Well, intelligence then is just like it's either received or mutated or whatever, like development of the most efficient like climbing of that local niche, right?
Right.
Like so you can, I don't know, like you see this kind of thing passed on generation or crop up genetically, right? Like certain like the Bernoulli family or something, right? There are lots of demonstrations of some relationship there. I think that it's like an inherited understanding of a particular adaptive niche.
Yes and no. It's kind of like, because one of the things is that absorption works this way as well, where it seems to be heritable. But, I think one of the things that people tend to forget is that people don't inherit a target value. They inherit a range of possible values, right?
Yeah.
So, let's say that, like, if you, like, look at the box and whisker plot, your inherited range is higher than my inherited range, right? But if I, through environmental input, through education and like being in a good place and being in the right place at the right time and things like that, absolutely maximize my potential, whereas you don't do anything with yours, I'm still going to be, in a practical sense, smarter than you are.
Yeah, absolutely, right. Because the inherited portion is the adapted like instantiation for the prior generation, right? And unless it's like contextless information. So
you inherit kind of an upper and lower bound.
And I guess it most often appears as just capacities, essentially, because they're
pretty much. Yeah.
And Callie wants to know what's your astrological sign.
Pigeon.
Pigeon. In what system?
I will concede that of all the many forms of magic, astrology is the one that I have the least patience for. Largely just because I think it's making category error. If you have to know, I was born during a new moon in Cancer, so have fun with that one.
A new moon in Cancer. Cool.
Well, that leads to a question that you talked with John at some depth about things like divination with tarot cards and the like, and you talked about the role that randomness plays in there as I guess as a method of spurring the imagination and opening up possibility. Can you just talk a little bit more about the role of randomness in divination? And I think because you distinguished it from astrology, which you said was a closed system, so it was not random. And just wondering if you could just explain a little more the distinction between a random system like tarot cards versus non-random in astrology, and what the implication of that is, you think, and how it can help.
So I will say this in defense of astrology. The astrological system is theoretically a closed system, but it's also so complicated that to the average human mind, it doesn't actually make that much of a difference. It's kind of like no one person is so good at predicting astrological events that they have made the entire system non-random. You will probably always be surprised by something just because you can't contain that much information. That said, I think the randomness is an important element of it because humans are very, very good at detecting patterns, right? The problem is we are very bad at unseeing patterns, right? Like, have any of you ever done like those perceptual puzzles, for instance? Once you see it, can you unsee it?
I had a lazy eye when I was a kid, and I had surgery on it, so those things don't work for me. Like 3D puzzle, like I can't see 3D in the movie theater either with the glasses. Yeah, I've seen.
How about that? Like, what was it? That like Laurel Yanni, like auditory illusion that was popular a while back. Yeah, like once you hear one of it, you can't hear the other.
Actually, right? I'll push back. I could switch them. I was able to switch them, but
that's I can too, but it's also just because this thing works weirdly. Some people are weird with perceptual illusions, largely people who have spent a lot of time figuring out how this thing works. Don't use me in any sort of perceptual experiments. Anyway, for the majority of people, that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, right? So one of the reasons you don't want to use a fixed pattern is because you're just going to default to that pattern, right? Like once you see the thing, that is the thing that you are going to base all of your predictions off of. What randomness in divination does is it constructs a new pattern for every problem. So you don't habituate to this kind of like one single grammar that you're just laying onto the universe. Because we have a word for people who use a single grammar to look at the universe, and they're called conspiracy theorists. So, this is kind of why I have a bit of a arm's length relationship with astrology. It's because it is one of those sufficiently, the problem is it's a sufficiently all-consuming system, much like the I Ching in China, where it has a lot of predictive power, but because it doesn't have that element of randomness, it is very easy to treat it as a fixed system, where it's like, just because this and this and this and this and this, this must happen. Granted, there are things within astrological systems done properly that are used to avoid that, but I think this is going to sound very strange, but I mean it in like a very neutral academic fashion. Human stupidity is doing a lot of the work in astrology just because we do not have the intellectual capacity to comprehend the entire star system. It's kind of it's substituting genuine mathematical randomness for human intellectual limitation. Not necessarily a bad thing. In a practical sense, it still works. It just, I don't know. Perhaps I'm arrogant, but it bothers me.
So when you say works for divination, and you talked a little bit about this with John, what does it mean that it works?
So I've actually put in a grant to try and actually run some experiments on this, because I think it'll turn up something interesting. But people do tend to give better advice and be better at predicting outcomes when they have access to a divination tool than not. Right? It's there's misconceptions about divination and fortune telling. Divination, fortune telling, even astrology is not supposed to do the check is going to be in the mail next Tuesday.
You can't get the lottery ticket numbers.
No, that's not how it works. What all divination systems share in common is, you remember how I was talking earlier about one of the things that helps immersion in a video game is the idea that there's a plot, that you have purpose. So divination systems run on the base assumption that there is a plot to the universe. Whether that plot is kind of just the unfolding of nature or the astrologically predetermined confluence of certain events, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that plot is a big thing in divination. So classically, when you went to go see a diviner, you went to go see a diviner because you'd lost the plot. Actually, funnily enough, that lives on in in a video game. If you play any high fantasy game, there will frequently be an NPC who's a fortune teller whose job it is to tell you what you're supposed to do next if you've forgotten. Because that's what they're for, right? Because what accompanies classically the sense of having lost the universal plot is this sense of disconnection, the sense of anxiety, the sense of depression, right? This sense of unhomedness in the universe because the narrative order has collapsed for you personally. So you go see a diviner because they are the person who patches the narrative order for you. They're like, okay, so you lost the plot. Okay, I'm going to pull some cards, do some calculations. Okay, so it sounds like, this is where you lost the plot. And if you want to get the plot back, this is what you should look for. They're going to couch themselves differently. So when I do tarot card readings for friends, right, I'll do a 5-card spread where it's okay, so this first card is clarification on your question. So this is what you're actually asking behind kind of the question that you gave me. This is where you are in your life such that this is a pertinent question. These are the resources you're bringing to the table. These are the resources that other people might be bringing to the table. And here's what you need to look for in order to resolve your difficulties with the plot. Basically, here's how to patch your plot holes. The I Ching works slightly differently. It'll do things like, okay, so here is a story that might unfold. And you come to a branching point in this story. A wiser person would do this. A more foolish person would do this. So the way that I Ching divination works is it's okay, so, I am casting my hexagram, and the hexagram that I get is essentially this narrative pattern. And, based on some other stuff, you're at this point in this narrative pattern, so you're at this branching decision tree. A wiser decision would be to do the thing that matches this pattern, whereas a more foolish decision would be to do the thing that matches this pattern, so don't do that. Kind of as a very complex decision-making tool, divination's still a fantastic tool. It's people like to joke of oh, the White House consulted an astrologer. I honestly don't see a problem with that. It's, ceteris paribus on decision-making principles. What the astrologer says, yeah, sure, why not? There's an apocryphal story about Napoleon where if he had to choose between two equally qualified people for a high military position, he'd interview them both and ask them if they were lucky. Because, all else being equal, I'm going to hire the lucky one because, even if you don't believe in luck, that might be getting at some capacity that we just haven't tapped yet.
So you spoke with John about what you call the Shamanistic Toolkit, which you roughly linked, categorized as, logic, ethics, and and physics as it as it was described back then. And then you said the world sort of fractured those and divvied them up around the societies. Am I getting right that part of your project is to help bring those back together?
In a grand cosmic sense, yeah, I guess. I personally would explain my project in terms of Fraser's distinction between practical magic and theoretical magic. Where Fraser's argument was that practical magic always precedes theoretical magic. The practices and observed effects always come before your explanation of what those are doing. So, the way that I would explain my project is you can replace theoretical magic with cognitive science and everything works just fine. But I think kind of in a grander scale, I'd argue especially because my approach as a teacher and my scientific research bleed into each other, like everything in my life bleeds into each other. But I'd say that my academic project is to replace theoretical magic with cognitive science. Just kind of on a standpoint of this changes absolutely nothing. Whereas my pedagogical project is to reconnect logic, physics, and ethics. Whenever I'm placed in charge of teaching, that's kind of, I view that more as a responsibility. You don't get to have one of these things without the other. They all kind of work together.
So we're coming up on 2 hours, so this will probably be the last question. You said to John that people are not good judges of their own rationality. So
no, they are not.
So how do we figure out if we're being rational?
This is why I also view it as my responsibility as a teacher to inflict a little bit of paranoia on my students. You can never be 100% sure. So, let's put it this way. So, a lot of the old Western psychotechnologies, and, you can argue to an extent the Eastern psychotechnologies as well, they plug kind of a nexus of virtues, right? You can take the Platonic definition of rationality as, what is good is, because basically the argument is, here are all these practices for self-transformation, and how do you know that you've transformed in a proper way? It is because you have begun cultivating one of these virtues. From the kind of Neoplatonic and even Stoic standpoint, basically, you have achieved transcendence when you've achieved rationality, and to be rational is to be free from non-consensual emotion. And I'll say non-consensual emotion because it's basically you are not rational if you cannot bring yourself to cry at your grandmother's funeral, right? No, that is a sign that you are probably disaffected in some sense, and that there's some stuff going on there. Not having an emotional reaction is sometimes as worrying as having an emotional reaction. What you want is the appropriate emotional reaction, right? You don't want to fly off the handle if they're out of the free butter at the movie theater or something like that, right? Confucianism kind of runs a similar bent, where the idea is to be, to have transcended is to be skilled at playing your role. To basically just be okay, I am a graduate student, so, this is my role, and I am doing well in the grand cosmic scheme of things if I am effectively playing this role. I am learning, I am beginning to teach, I am talking to people, I am helping my supervisor. I am sometimes holding my supervisor back from doing something stupid, because this is what you do when you're an upper year graduate student. Things like Gnosticism associated it with freedom, but one of the problems is that freedom is not actually a virtue. You can do all sorts of things with freedom. A lot of them are bad. So I don't know. As far as the rationality goes, I prefer to cleave closer to the old Stoic definitions of rationality as being free from non-consensual emotions. With the caveat that that does not mean you are free from emotions. It means that when you feel, you can accept what you're feeling, and you feel it is appropriate and acceptable to the circumstances.
Oh, well, yeah. Oh, yeah. Go on. Were you?
No. I mean, that's kind of it. The reason why I say that people are bad judges of their own rationality is because people, one, they're bad judges of what rationality is, right? They're like, rationality means you are using nothing but logic all the time. No. It's not. No. And they're also, to a certain extent, bad at figuring out what emotion is appropriate to a particular situation, right? Like, and this is why I think things like aspiration are important in the pursuit of rationality, because you want to go and you want to find somebody who is using reason and emotion in the right balance, and you want to go do whatever they're doing. Right? The most dangerous people on the planet are people who have convinced themselves that their emotional reactions are logical. Because we don't work that way.
All right, well, this has been a great discussion, and thank you so much for being here. Is there a way, like, if people are interested in your work, or how do they keep tabs on what you're doing?
I am in the process of trying to update a website. We're actually currently overhauling. So I'm in two labs right now: the Wisdom and Identity Lab with Michelle Ferrari and the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Lab with John Vervaeke. We're currently overhauling the Wisdom and Identity Lab website. So if you go looking for that one, probably within the next month, better updates will exist. I need to create a web page. I just hate the internet. So. Oh God, don't quote me on that. I don't hate the people on the internet. I'm just like, I'm the last generation that was not technically digital natives. So like, I'm comfortable with technology and everything. It's just not kind of where I prefer to live.
Well, thank you again so much. This has been just great. Really glad to have you. Hope you will be back. I'd love to talk more about shamanism and this topic I don't know a lot about, but I sense that there's a deep well of information there that's probably really useful for us to have, and I love hearing about it with you and Laban Pascal, and that's a topic that we'd love to dive into more.
Oh yeah, I mean, feel free to call me back. Yeah, it's I think we were talking a little bit about before this, but it's funny, like this server exists in an interesting professional personal boundary for me, because it's like, okay, is the time that I spend here work or not work? I'm not sure. This is one of the problems when this is your career.
Well, it could be both, but we would love to, I mean, we'd love to have you around the server. I think you'd find, I hope you'd find some interesting things around here, some great conversations, and we're trying to build something. Sort of new here, so there's a lot of ways that we can grow, and
no, it's interesting, and I'm glad to see this is going on. And I'll also admit, another one of the reasons why I kind of stay away from these areas and John's YouTube page is because I don't want to accidentally turn into St. Paul. If for those of you who understand that reference. Yes, I work with John, but we also disagree on a lot, and I'm kind of prone to tease him occasionally. So, my words should not be taken for what John thinks.
Oh, and just to be clear here too, we encourage a polite disagreement with John too. We don't want people coming in and just ranting with profanities or being disrespectful, but we want people, and I know John wants people to disagree with him when they disagree. So
that's why I have my
That's where you have your doubt.
No, I said that's why I have my job.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we definitely don't want to idolize John in that way here either. So that's great. And thank you everyone for being here. Great questions. And thank you so much for spending your time with us. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe, and share this video with others. And again, thanks a lot to Juensung for being here, or Juensung. Apologies. And that was just fantastic.